Hello and greetings from UB. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the UB School of Management, we are delighted you are able to join us for today's presentation. My name is Christy Fields and I manage the Alumni Careers and Lifelong Learning program here at UB. It's sure an exciting time of year on campus as we enter commencement season and begin to welcome our new graduates to the UB alumni family. In addition, I have the honor and pleasure today to welcome and introduce you to Tim Maynes, Assistant Professor of Organization and Human Resources in the University at Buffalo School of Management. In this webinar, Professor Maynes will share what the latest research tells us about the impediments to speaking up and how to overcome these barriers to create a culture that supports speaking up in your organization. We will leave some time during today's webinar for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the GoToWebinar control panel question chat section that you see on your screen, and you can do so at any time during today's presentation. In addition, we will be recording today's session and we'll send you all a copy within the next 24 hours. With that said, it's my pleasure to now turn it over to Professor Tim Maynes.
Thank you, Christy. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning, and I'm excited to share, as Christy mentioned, with you some of my thoughts and research, as well as the research of others on creating a culture that fosters speaking up in organizations. So employee voice is the technical term that we use in research to describe speaking up and sharing improvement-oriented ideas and suggestions or raising concerns about potential issues or problems inside of organizations to those with the power to initiate change. So throughout the rest of the webinar, when I'll use the terms voice and speaking up, sharing opinions and so on interchangeably. So why is voice important? I think that probably most of us have an intuitive idea that voice is fairly important, and probably even have some ideas about how that works, how voice contributes to an organization. But just to kind of make that clear, in today's rapidly changing business environment, competitive pressures to adapt and innovate are fairly unyielding. Wise leaders have learned, though, that employees are a valuable repository of fresh ideas, perspectives, opinions, and can help organizations to innovate and to adapt and to develop new and better ways of doing things. And the research supports this. When employees speak up, what the research shows is that when they speak up and share ideas or to point out potential problems that need to be addressed, research demonstrates that innovation does, in fact, increase, that worker safety improves in organizations, and that overall performance is also enhanced. In one of these studies, Indiana University researchers Scott McKenzie and Phil Podzikoff in 2011 found in a study of 150 locations of a limited menu restaurant. So think of a restaurant where you come in and it's kind of like a semi-fast food type of restaurant. And what they found in that study was that in restaurants in which workers spoke up frequently with improvement-oriented ideas and often helped each other with work-related tasks, in those locations where that was happening to a high degree, those locations earned $20,000 more per year in revenue than restaurants with low levels of employee voice or speaking up. That's an advantage of about $1 million across the 150 restaurants that were included in the study, and more than $3 million across the entire company. So that's a pretty tremendous dollar amount given the size of the organization. Plus, not just, it wasn't just the case that they had higher levels of revenue. It was also true that their profits as a percentage of sales were dramatically higher as well. So they got to keep more of their money. They earned more money and they got to keep more of it. And so it was sort of a double blessing in that way. I don't know if you know this, but the Post-it note was the result of an employee suggestion. It was officially released in 1980. It was developed by a 3M scientist who he got tired of his bookmarks falling out of his church hymnal when he was singing in the church choir. And so he developed this, a semi-tacky glue and put it on the back of a piece of paper, and that became the Post-it note. And analysts estimate that the annual revenue attributable to the Post-it note for 3M is somewhere in excess of $1 billion a year. You may not know as well that Amazon Prime was the result of an employee suggestion. So tremendous benefits accrue to organizations when employees speak up and share ideas. The challenge is, or one of the challenges is, that despite the organizational benefits of voice, employees are often hesitant to speak up and challenge how things are done in organizations. Why is that the case? Some employees fear that voicing will damage relationships with others at work or result in negative consequences, social consequences like retribution or sanctions. Research also indicates that others keep quiet because they believe that voicing is wasted effort and will not produce meaningful change. They kind of have a cynical attitude about whether or not change can actually work or occur in an organization. And still others withhold their voice because they don't believe that they are capable of speaking up effectively. So the result of all of that is that a recent survey found that between 80 and 90% of employees feel uneasy about raising issues even when the issue is important. And 70% reported that they were afraid to voice their opinions at work. So that's pretty tremendous impediment to speaking up. In one study, researchers interviewed a female chemist at a biotechnology firm, and she described her fear associated with speaking up in this way. She said managers would take mental notes and you couldn't really express yourself. They would hold it against you. They valued loyalty above all else. You had to watch what you said. If you did an okay job and never said anything controversial, you would move up in the organization. A salesperson in that same study described his concern in these words. My manager determines my destiny at the company. Therefore, I dare not challenge him and what he's telling me to do. So in a sense, it's not safe to speak up, and that was this gentleman's conclusion. I don't know how many of you can identify with one or both of these statements. Maybe you've had similar experiences. Before I became a professor, I worked in a CPA firm. I was an accountant, and I held other jobs as well. And I can say that I've maybe not to the same degree as these quotes illustrate, but that I felt similar things in my previous work experience. Employees, unfortunately, voice is valuable for organizations. Employees appear to be hesitant to share it. And unfortunately, employees are not alone in their negative feelings about voice. Research indicates that some managers display a strong aversion to voice. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Some managers feel threatened potentially by voice because they perceive it as a criticism of their leadership rather than as an attempt to help. More generally, some leaders consider employee participation in decision-making, policy development, or change initiatives as an abdication of authority. In their mind, a leader's job is to develop improvements and identify problems. And the job of employees, of subordinates, is to implement the ideas of their boss. Another reason managers may be averse to voice is that many managers feel that they're overworked. They already have a lot going on, and it can be pretty challenging to try to implement and to make sense of employee suggestions and to figure out how to get them to work. And it's not an easy thing to implement suggestions. Depends on the organization, but it often, regardless of the company, it often involves convincing others in the organization of the merit of the changes to get buy-in and support. So it's not an easy thing. And the combined effect of all of these challenges or impediments for managers is that many managers don't want to hear voice. And so we have this troubling situation Organizations benefit from voice, but employees don't want to share it, and managers often don't want to hear it. So how do you create a culture that values voice behavior? How do you do that? And let's consider that question for the next 30 to 45 seconds. If you would, for me there at your own individual computer or wherever you are, if you could just give that question some thought for about 30 seconds. I'll go silent here and let you think about it. And as you have some thoughts about how, as a leader of an organization, or maybe not even in a leadership role, what do you do to help to create a culture of voice? And if you could, if you're comfortable, share some of those in the chat area of the webinar. And then after about 30 seconds, we'll have Christy tell us some of the things that she's seeing. So I'll let you now with 30 seconds or so, 30 to 45 seconds. I'm going to continue on here, and I don't know if we've got some that have been shared there, Christy. But if we have, feel free to share some of those.
A couple that have been shared here. So now that we have a handful in, Tim, I will share some of those with you. And now they seem to be coming in quite quickly. So I will share a couple of those with you. Ask questions instead of making statements. Lead with a posture of curiosity. Offer incentives to employees who voice any good and thoughtful suggestions. Incentivize and reward employees for sharing ideas rather than punishing. Another one would be actually talk to your direct reports along with encourage open door policy and active listening. Talk about the why behind the decisions that are made. Encourage employees to share, listen, and do not be judgmental. Keep things confidential if necessary. If an informal setting, share some of your own shortcomings and ask for more from your staff. Continue to ask for feedback. Include employees in troubleshooting, brainstorming, closing the loop, sharing results of feedback, and create safe spaces. Those are just a handful that have come in so far.
Well, those are wonderful, and you'll see a number of the themes that were mentioned there in those comments throughout the remainder of what we're going to talk about today. In particular, I really like some of these things around listening, being transparent about weaknesses and limitations, rewarding and recognizing those who provide suggestions. And I really like that idea of being curious and sort of taking a curiosity approach rather than a critical approach when making suggestions. So I think all of them were wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And like I said, I think we'll see a number of these ideas scattered as themes throughout the rest of what we're going to talk about today. So I want to just, for the remainder of my remarks, I wanted to focus on 4 principles for developing a culture of voice in teams, work groups, departments, organizations, and so on. The first one is to foster trusting relationships, and we'll go into more detail about what each of these are and how to make it work. The second one, encourage experimentation and learning. Number 3, provide voice lessons. 4, offer voice appreciation training. So the first one here is to foster the development of trusting relationships among group members. If there's one thing that's clear from the research, it's that the fear of negative social consequences is likely the largest, strongest impediment to voice. But research also indicates that strong relationships may be the single greatest antidote for this challenge. When employees have high quality relationships with their boss and with their coworkers, they're significantly more likely to speak up. It's just, I suppose it's just human nature more generally, but if we trust people and have good relationships, we're more likely to engage in behaviors that may be perceived as slightly risky. In his book, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but In his book on the 5 dysfunctions of a team, management guru Patrick Lencioni describes trust as the confidence among team members that their peers' intentions are good, and that there is no reason to be protective or careful around the group. In essence, teammates are comfortable being vulnerable with one another. So that's an essential concept related to voice. And one of the suggestions there a moment ago from one of you was about creating safe spaces. And I think that trust is a big part of that. So when does and how does trust develop? Trust develops when there is an open and transparent communication about weaknesses, mistakes, when there are requests and offers of help, and when there's a willingness to ask questions and to seek feedback. Of course, though, the development of trust takes time, as anyone knows, and it requires the observation of multiple incidents of credibility over an extended period of time from every member of the group, and it all starts with the leader, in my view. The leader sets the tone by being vulnerable. If the leader is unwilling to be vulnerable and to share mistakes and weaknesses and limitations, then the members of the group are going to be hesitant as well. Leaders also need to, the research indicates that leaders really need, in order to develop trusting relationships among members of the team, have to be fair and exhibit fairness. They can't play favorites. And they need to quickly extinguish any backbiting or politicking that may go on. Can't let it kind of continue to fester in the background. We also know that once trust is violated, and this is a pretty clear finding in the research literature, that once trust is violated, it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to ever fully restore it. So, in the first place, have to try as best as we can to build the relationships and then not to damage them. The second thing here that I mentioned as a principle to encourage voice and to build a culture of voice is to encourage experimentation and learning. And there are a number of things here to discuss, but the research is clear that although performance goals and objectives drive results, and that's something that we do in almost all of our organizations, we set goals and objectives and we determine how to get to those goals and objectives. And although that's very, very important and should not be abandoned, when we do that and go through that process, it also narrows the focus so that experimentation and continuous improvement tend to be negatively impacted. The reason is because employees, they're smart people and they focus on maximizing their own outcomes. And to the extent that meeting those performance outcomes or standards is the best way to do that, then that's how they're going to spend their time. In addition, there's another thing that is true in many organizations, and it's that there's a tendency to focus on preventing mistakes and failures. And it's not that we should be seeking out mistakes and failures, but when we have that emphasis, when that's sort of the first priority is preventing mistakes and not being embarrassed and so on, rather than on ambitiously pursuing new opportunities, that intensifies the challenge where people want to hide, keep back their voice and not share it. A culture that emphasizes the prevention of mistakes produces fear of failure. And that fear is an enemy to experimentation and learning. So a learning culture is characterized by collaboration, knowledge sharing, admission of mistakes, questioning without fear, and feedback seeking. As I mentioned before I became a professor, I worked for a CPA firm, and we had a retreat one year for the junior staff, and I was new in the firm. And in that retreat, the partners told us we needed to be on the constant lookout for ways to improve the firm. And we all got really excited. The partners kind of pumped us up, and they were focusing us on this idea of experimenting and learning and trying new things, and we all got really excited. Several months later, I was preparing a nasty tax return for a guy who had done a fair amount of stock trading during the year, and the information from a 20-page brokerage statement. I don't know if any of you have engaged in stock trading, but if you do enough of it, you get this brokerage statement that tells you about all of the transactions you've engaged in throughout the year. So I had this 20-page brokerage statement that needed to be summarized in the tax software. And normally the process was to add all of that information up and to kind of summarize it using a 10-key calculator. I don't know if you've seen those, but it's with the little roll of ticker tape paper on the back of the calculator, and as you type, it prints. It's kind of like a typewriter. And that was the technology that we used at the time. And so I was supposed to have done that and to summarize it and have this ticker tape of all of the stock transactions as a summary. Well, instead of doing that, we had just gotten this new in the firm a new high-speed scanner with optical text recognition capabilities. And so I decided to take this brokerage statement down to the scanner and use that optical text recognition to convert the file, the paper brokerage statement into a Microsoft Excel file, and then summarize the transactions that way. Well, so I did that, and then I turned in the tax return that I'd prepared and the supporting documents to the partner, and he was so angry with me. I got to tell you, he became very upset, called me into his office, and proceeded to give me a lecture on the importance of following our standard procedures. And so, I got the message really quickly. They had asked for experimentation and learning and trying new things, but it didn't seem like that's what he actually wanted when it came down to it. Of course, I probably did it the wrong way. I probably should have went and asked permission first. That was my own fault. But it took me a long time before I was comfortable trying out new things or expressing my views about doing something in a different way. So kind of have to be careful as the leader on that front. So how do you go about developing a learning culture? There are a number of ways, but the common element, it seems, is to institutionalize the behavior of speaking up. And what do we mean by that? Having some practices that encourage and reward and put value on speaking up. One thing is give managers some decision-making authority over smaller incremental changes, so they don't have to go through bureaucracy or red tape to get things approved. That can be very helpful. Setting times and places or structures like team meetings and so on for employees to speak their mind, and make those happen frequently so that people become comfortable with others disagreeing, and it's not so painful. It's not a threat to the ego. There's not as much pain or an ouch associated with disagreement. Set rules that govern how we interact in those meetings. Get input from everybody across the team and write those down so that we have a set of norms about how we engage in this kind of discussion and dialogue, and where we maintain respect for each other and it doesn't devolve into a situation where we have maybe personal conflicts arising. So with that in mind, keep disagreement and conflict focused on ideas and not on individual or personal differences. And the final thing that I wanted to mention here is that for some reason, the way our minds work, when we share an idea, when we share a suggestion, in some way, I guess we're sharing a part of ourselves when we do that. And so it's easy for us to become threatened, or for someone else when they share their ideas. If others disagree, it's easy to be threatened and to become upset if people express criticism or make suggestions that our ideas aren't that great. And so something that can help is to separate evaluation of ideas from idea generation. What I mean by that is not evaluating the idea the moment that somebody shares it. Kind of thinking about it for a time and then coming back and talking about it later can help to reduce the threat to the ego. The third principle or third recommendation is to train employees on how to speak up so that their suggestions are more likely to be heard and implemented. What research isn't yet clear on, and I'd like to do some studies about, is whether employees' fears of damaging relationships are as valid as they think they are. I'm not sure about that, but what seems to be clear is that employees need confidence. They need to be bolstered and strengthened. And I think providing some training about how to speak up effectively could do that. And research does indicate that simple social skills dramatically improve voice outcomes. That when socially skilled employees speak up, not only are they not punished, but the odds of producing change increases, and the voicing employee is often rewarded for their effort rather than being punished. So a few simple skills can help dramatically. The first element of speaking up effectively, I like to mention here, and the first three of these suggestions on speaking up effectively come from a study that I conducted with a few colleagues when I was at Indiana University, and the first one here is to develop credibility. I don't know if you've had this experience. I know that I've had it, but there are some times where employees will speak up, people will speak up in meetings as if they're an authority on a topic, and they actually have relatively little expertise on that particular thing. When they do that, there's a tendency for us to brush aside their thoughts or to ignore them. That's not necessarily the right thing for us to do, but that's what we do. So taking that into account, you know, speaking up in areas where you are an expert, where an employee is an expert, can help tremendously. And then over time, you build expertise and you build credibility. It's also important to not always speak up out of self-interest. When we do that, it also damages trust because what employees start to realize quickly is that the only time that a person speaks up is when it will help them, and it may be the case that the way they speak up doesn't help anyone else. And when that happens over an extended period of time, credibility is damaged. The second point here to consider is timing. In this particular study, we found that employees need to be mindful of the timing of when they speak up. Speaking up at a time when the boss is buried in paperwork or is working overtime to meet deadlines imposed by those higher up the hierarchy is not a great time to share suggestions. Unlikely that the proper attention will be paid to the suggestions. Of course, there are things that an employee should bring up right away. If there's something, for example, that impacts worker safety, then of course that employee should share it. But many times we have some control over and some choice over when we speak up and share suggestions. And so being considerate and thinking about our boss and what's on their plate can be very helpful. Another issue that related to this that is helpful to consider is the social context. If it's known that the suggestion might ruffle a few feathers, then it might be better to have some offline conversations with those who are likely to be opposed to the ideas beforehand. Research findings do indicate that just being exposed to an idea improves the likelihood of acceptance. The next thing that we learned was that offering suggestions goes a long way in helping the voice to be more effective. Some employees speak up and just raise issues, just point out problems. And what we found in our study was that when employees did that, bosses tend to perceive that as just complaining. But when you have an employee who has kind of thought through the issue and maybe develops 2 or 3 alternative solutions to the problem, the bosses really do appreciate that. It maybe decreases the burden on them, and the result is they tend to react much more positively to that kind of voice. And then the final thing here comes from another study conducted not by me, but by Adam Grant, who's a professor at the Wharton School of Business. And maybe you have seen this kind of phenomenon in your own experience. Have you ever seen someone get angry or frustrated about something and then speak up in the heat of the moment, in a meeting? I know I've seen that. And the question is, how did it work out for them? Did others react positively? Were they excited about it? My suspicion is that it didn't go very well. And a study conducted by Adam Grant confirms that idea that intense emotions like frustration or anger or dissatisfaction often drive employees to speak up. And that's true, I've seen it. I think you probably have too. Yet those very emotions that spur us to speak up and to express voice may compromise our ability to do it constructively. and prevents managers from reacting more favorably. If we're angry, other people can see that we're angry. It gets their emotions kind of riled up too. And so instead of, and so the situation escalates rather than having a calm, cool conversation about something that we can do to improve. So what the researchers suggested coming out of that study was that regulating our emotions and maintaining calm composure, employees who could do that were most effective at getting their ideas heard and implemented. And it actually also was something that came to benefit the employees in terms of higher performance evaluations ultimately. And that's probably because it's less threatening to the boss. The final recommendation is to train supervisors, especially new ones, to respond effectively to voice. Research evidence reveals that managers who are able to respond effectively have lower turnover rates on their teams, have higher performance, and have direct reports that are more satisfied and engaged. And I think all leaders, those are outcomes that all leaders would be excited about. So voice appreciation. How do you go about training on that? There are several principles I want to mention just quickly, and several of these were mentioned earlier by some of you. And so these are, I wouldn't say these things are necessarily new, but or difficult to understand conceptually, but they are sometimes difficult for leaders, managers, especially new ones, to implement. So the first item here is to listen. And it shouldn't be surprising that simply feeling heard makes a big difference for voicing employees. When managers use active listening skills like mirroring and reflecting and asking follow-up questions and seeking to understand, employees feel heard and validated. And that's a very important part of this. But what was surprising, and this is really kind of interesting to me, is that preliminary research also indicates that implementation of suggestions isn't necessary for employees to feel satisfied with their voicing experience. Let me say that again. So employees don't need their ideas to actually be implemented to feel some level of validation for what they were doing. Being heard is enough. Having said that, one of you mentioned the importance of explaining why suggestions may not be implemented, and that's really critical. Although it isn't necessary to implement every suggestion, leaders still do need to explain why certain ideas are not implemented. If that's not done, then over time, employees will start to develop a bit of cynicism. That's what the research tells us. So it's the combination of listening and explaining, and that does a lot to encourage employees to speak up over and over and over again. The next point here is to empower voicers. So like I mentioned earlier, managers feel overwhelmed often, especially new managers. I recently held a panel discussion with a group of brand new managers. There are about 10 of them in the room, and the question I had posed to them is, what were some of the challenges that you experienced as you were promoted to be a leader for the first time that you didn't anticipate? What were the sort of aha moments or surprising things? And we had quite a robust conversation, and about halfway through it, a young woman raised her hand who was a new leader, a new boss. She said, what was surprising to me was the tremendous demands that are placed on me and my time by my subordinates, and me needing to solve problems for them. And so she started to do what she called working the second shift. And that meant she was coming in on weekends and staying late because she was helping her employees all day and was unable to get her own work done. And I think that's unfortunate. As employees come with suggestions, managers shouldn't necessarily feel a duty to take over responsibility for the employee ideas. That's not necessary. Overwhelmed supervisors, they may not know how to move an idea forward. They should encourage the voicer to take some ownership for their suggestion. Let them know that you think it's a good idea, but then also give them the latitude and the autonomy and the freedom to pursue it. And that can help reduce the burden on the manager. And then providing feedback. In addition, managers shouldn't view a suggestion as the end point, but as a beginning of a conversation instead about the best way to make a change. And so it's helpful if managers provide feedback on how to improve the suggestions that come to them. And then finally, keeping employees in the loop, updating them on the status of voice suggestions as those suggestions, and to the degree that they need to, make their way up the organization when higher levels of approval are needed. Otherwise, like was mentioned earlier, employees may feel a level of cynicism that change never seems to happen around here, not recognizing that it does take time for change to occur. So just quickly to summarize what we've talked about fostering trusting relationships. We've talked about encouraging experimentation and learning, providing voice lessons and offering voice appreciation training for managers. All critical, I think, in the process of developing a culture of voice. So that's the end of what I was gonna share. It's been a pleasure to share those ideas with you today. I hope you feel that the principles we've discussed are useful and helpful, applicable to the work that you do. Thank you for tuning in. Now I'm gonna turn the time back to Christy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. This has been fantastic. It's been beneficial information. Great presentation today. The first question that has been submitted for the Q&A is, how do you coach an individual to embrace speaking up when their prior experience or culture discouraged speaking up?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, and probably not an uncommon one, given the mobility of employees today, that they've worked in a place where voice was frowned upon or discouraged. I think the only way to do it is over time. A leader can demonstrate that vulnerability that we talked about in developing a trusting relationship. That's the critical part to overcoming fear of failure, fear of negative repercussions, is to develop a trusting relationship. So, going to that employee, inviting them to provide critical feedback of something that you're working on as a leader, demonstrating that vulnerability can help them to feel like you're someone who can be trusted. So that's one idea. Soliciting input and suggestions on other things going on in the organization, and then just treating that person with respect and consideration. I think that's the critical thing, is to overcome fear through the building of a trusting relationship.
Excellent. Tim, the next question that was submitted, what do you do when questioning a coworker leads to their verbalization of feeling harassed?
Let me see. So questioning them about something that they're doing in their work, or a suggestion that they made. I'll just kind of assume that's probably what's being asked. Maybe so. I'm wondering if that person feels like they're being singled out, and they're being treated differently than other people, maybe more harshly. And in my view, the critical thing there is to have clear policies, clear procedures, clear practices that are always followed, and explain to the person that that you implement those things in a consistent way across all people, even if they don't see it. See all of your interactions with other people in the organization, other members of the team, that you are in fact applying those standards equally, I think, is the critical part of that.
Fantastic. And then, Tim, the next question, how do you encourage ownership, implementation of suggestions without fostering an environment where speaking up equals more work, preventing them from voicing in the future?
Yeah, I think that is a danger. So you got to be a little bit careful about that. So that's a very good insight. So the danger is that um, if every time a suggestion comes to a manager, the manager says, "Wonderful, why don't you take that on and get that change to happen?" Then yet it's very possible that employees, some employees, not all, but some employees will react to that in a way that they start to realize that speaking up means more work for them. Um, I think being clear, um, as you're having conversations with employees, they come with suggestions. Being clear that the suggestions they're bringing also means work for you as the boss, so they understand that that making change isn't an easy thing and it takes time and effort, and maybe thinking of it more as a collaboration and something that you're going to work together on. So encouraging. That's why I think providing feedback, a boss providing feedback on suggestions, it's probably a rare thing for an employee to come with a suggestion that is in a final form ready to be implemented. And so just recognizing that and viewing that first suggestion as a draft that we're going to work on together, and have the employee come back later and with the revised and updated suggestion, and being willing to brainstorm a little bit, making it more of a joint effort, and so it's not a lonely effort for either person, can help. Um, and so just helping, I guess, employees to feel like you're there for them, but that you also expect them to carry a part of the load.
Great, excellent. And then, Tim, the next question, I know you mentioned the book earlier in your presentation. Just an attendee wanted to know, are there any further reading suggestions that you have regarding this topic of creating a culture that fosters speaking up?
Yes, so one that I think can help if you're in the position of wanting to speak up. Um, eh, there's a book that's a really great book called Crucial Conversations: Tools for Talking When the Stakes Are High. And it has a number of really good suggestions. I mean, it's more general than just speaking up in organizations, but there are a number of helpful tips and practices in that book that are really quite tremendous.
Great suggestion. The next question, Tim, that came through, do you have ideas on how to manage up or even laterally to promote others to use the strategies provided in this webinar?
Manage up, like manage relationships with peers or with higher ups. Is that the question?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, there's a study done, and this is an important point, so I'm grateful for the question. There was a study done that found something really quite interesting, which is that um, to develop trusting relationships, one organization put together some meetings, just sort of periodic meetings, once a quarter or something, and they were informal social event type of meetings. And in those meetings, they had employees, the bosses, and then what they called the skip level leader, which is the boss's boss. And having a relationship with the boss's boss actually increased the level of voice from the employee to their first line boss, not to the skip level leader, but and it was because what the researchers think was going on is that trusting the skip level leader enhanced the maybe trust in the organization more generally, and the willingness of the employee to share suggestions with their supervisor. So that's something that can be done, is to enhance relationships, not just within a team, but also hierarchically or horizontally up the organization. That can be very helpful. Another thing that's, if a person is interested just sort of on an individual level basis, they're a leader and they're looking to increase their ability to implement suggestions that are made by their employees. And any leader knows that that requires resources, and that oftentimes that means that you're going to be relying on people in other departments at different levels throughout the organization. And so what research tells us about the building of those kinds of relationships is that they're primarily built on social exchange, that you help others, and so then in turn they're going to help you. There can be a tendency for some leaders, especially when they're new, to focus almost exclusively on their team and the relationships among the members of their team, and ignore relationships with people more generally in the organization. So getting involved in something like a task force or a committee that maybe isn't necessarily, in line with your area of the business, but where people are needed to help, can help that person to develop relationships more generally that then can be used or relied upon later when they're needed, to be called on to implement suggestions.
Excellent. And Tim, the next question that was submitted, how would you advise an employee always having to execute their suggestions? They want to promote change and avoid burnout.
So we've got an employee who is maybe has a lot of good ideas, or and they can't do them all, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
They're looking for help with that. Yeah. Well, the first thing I would say is that it sounds possible that the employee could benefit from, you have a lot of ideas, and I think this is true for a lot of us. We have a lot of ideas, acknowledging that some are better than others and prioritizing where time is going to be placed. As an employee, what do you want to be known for? What do you want to build a reputation for or an expertise in? And then focusing the effort in those areas, and sharing suggestions and ideas with coworkers, and saying, if you want to run with this, you can. So letting other people have ownership and run with things if they're interested in them, but that focusing your own efforts on your areas of expertise or areas in which you want to build expertise, the type of thing that you want to be known for in the organization. That's the advice I'd give for that one.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. Those are all the questions that have come through at this time. So I do want to just tell you how grateful we are for the opportunity to have you share this great information, great research with us and with all of our UB alumni on the line. I know some comments came in just saying how grateful they were for the presentation. It was an excellent presentation, so thank you so much, Tim. On behalf of both the Office of Alumni Engagement and the School of Management, we're very thankful for your time, for sharing your knowledge, your research, and your expertise with all of us. Just as a reminder for the entire group, we have recorded this webinar, and we'll send you the link within the next 24 hours, so you'll get an email from us with that link so you can rewatch the webinar, share with others, and just find some time at your leisure to go back and digest this great information. I also want you to save the date for next week's webinar on Wednesday, May 22nd. We're going to be joined by two UB School of Management alums, Nate Carberry and Chris DiGiro, who will speak about moving from Excel to data automation and visualization tools. So if you'd love to join us next week, just check out that. You're going to receive additional communication. It's always on our website as well. We do also have a slate of webinars for June, so keep checking your emails and our alumni website for additional details and registration. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Tim, for all the beneficial information today. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and go Bulls. Thank you.